Alice Notley is widely known for her unique take on poetry. She's produced many works, including best-selling collections containing some of her poetry. However, this poet leaves a lot up to the reader to interpret. Though frustrating at times, the style is characteristic not only of Notley, but of many of her New York School contemporaries. Throughout this documentary, we'll get to know the powerful woman behind Mysteries of Small Houses and The Descent of Alette on a deeper level. Exactly who is Alice Notley? What are the main influences on Notley's poetry, and how do these influences show up in her work? After exploring these questions, we'll take a look into how she has influenced the work of other poets, specifically those from the New York School. She grew up in Needles, California with her family. From a young age, she had an adventurous spirit. She enjoyed reading books, watching movies, and playing piano. As she describes in her memoir, Tell Me Again, she played around with identity, infatuated with the idea of a name being a word that can contain so much of one's personality. Notley writes, "For the first 5 years of my life, I thought my name was Libby Notley. When I was 6, I found out my real name was Alice Elizabeth Notley. 5 years is a long time to be wrong about what your own name is. I was completely shocked." She even relates this notion to her studies of the Bible, saying, "The New Testament seemed too short, too lacking in women, too full of letters written by St. Paul, though he was a great character and belonged to one of my favorite biblical categories, people who changed their names, like Abraham and Sarah and Naomi for that instant, and Simon Peter." Aside from this idea, Notley was affected by death from a very young age, first experiencing grief with the death of her Aunt Dorothy. This grief would stick with her through the death of many more friends and family members, permeating both her personal life and her writing. Notley attended Barnard College and continued to earn a master's degree from Iowa Writers' Workshop. After college, Notley met fellow poet Ted Berrigan, and they moved around from New York to Rhode Island to California. In 1972, Berrigan and Notley married and moved to Chicago, where Notley eventually gave birth to their 2 children. This transition into motherhood marked the most influential point in Notley's life, and this shift is reflected in her poetry. Throughout the 1960s and 1970s, Notley remained active in the New York and Chicago poetry scenes. However, in 1976, Berrigan became sick with hepatitis. He later died in 1983. This death caused a dark transition in the writing style of Notley. During her period of mourning, she wrote one of her most critically acclaimed poems, At Night, the States. When she and Berrigan lived in Bolinas, California, there was a strong poetry presence, including Joanne Kiger, Philip Wallen, Bill Berkson, Robert Creeley, and Bobby Louise Hawkins. Some of Notley's feminist views were influenced by her attending school at Barnard College, New York, an all-female school with distinct political views. More of her primary poetic influences when she was younger included Bernadette Mayer and Anne Waldman. Now, Notley primarily reads the works of John Ashbery. The tyrant is us. The tyrant is what enslaves us to our forms. The tyrant is the form of our life, the form of our politics, the form of our universities, the form of our knowledge, our thinking we know something. All of that is the tyrant. She goes on to say, "The Descent of Alette is about the liberation of women, but it's also about the liberation of everyone. If you can keep half of humankind down, then everybody is oppressed. Women mostly feel power in superficial ways in their lives, through feelings like sympathy or love, but women hardly ever feel power over influential aspects of life." This goes back to the idea of the influence of Berrigan's death on Notley's life. Yes, it had a great impact on Notley's personal life, but it transferred the power of fame from the hands of the more dominant male into the hands of the lesser recognized female. In this light, the death of Berrigan can be seen as a positive influence on both Notley's life and on her poetry. Another of the main themes in The Descent of Alette deals with the idea of identity. Now, this idea can often be explored in a cliché manner, one in which the writer explores the deeper meaning of who they truly are or hope to become. But Notley, in her characteristic style, does not follow the customary find oneself's route. Rather, she explores the meaning of I, as in the pronoun replacement used to cover up one's name. Notley explores the idea that the I is what one strips down to. And she says in her essay titled The Poetics of Disobedience, "I came to the conclusion that self means I, and also means poverty. It's what one strips down to, who you are when you've stripped down." This powerful quote reveals a deep truth about Notley. She feels most defined by poverty. Maybe it's the poverty she faced as a struggling writer, maybe it's the poverty in a figurative sense, referring to her numerous encounters with death. It's unclear in this case what she's referring to, but regardless, this is what she feels is lying at her core when all external influences are stripped away. This idea of I is also explored in her other critically acclaimed work, Mysteries of Small Houses. The intention of this book is more autobiographical. Notley describes her early life and experiences through her unique poetical lens. Since Mysteries of Small Houses is about Notley's own personal experiences and less about the hypothetical experience of another woman, as is the case in The Descent of Alette, the writer is trying to redefine I in a more personal sense. She eventually comes to the conclusion that all truth, whether it be with respect to I or with respect to a generalized social condition, comes from other people's ideas. She grapples with this notion in Disobedience, one of her longest and most comprehensive works. This raises many questions about commonly perceived notions about many things in culture that we accept as true. For example, if this I that we think of and refer to on a regular basis is essentially an arbitrary idea that encapsulates only our essential being, then how can we define you and we and other pronouns of this nature? If I is the essence of one's being, then you is the recipient of the ideas of I, the audience in your head that gets to interpret the thoughts and actions of I. Notley's idea of we is much more concrete, as it's influenced by John Ashbery's use of the pronoun. On a similar note, Notley struggled with the difference between the self and the soul. Let's listen to the poem Lady Poverty from Mysteries of Small Houses. It's appropriate here to say that the I of Alette is explicitly a plural for the entire second book. Alette incorporates the personas of all the people in the subway into her own, becoming a blur of corporeal entities, which then leave her at the beginning of the third book. It is only as a one-person I that stands for we that she can take on the knowledge offered in the caves. I am still, 20 years later, trying to understand our given pronouns and my relation to them. Along a similar path, Notley wrestles with the power and potency of words. Throughout these two books, not only does Notley struggle to define herself, but she also believes that words do not carry enough power for true meaning to be portrayed. In The Poetics of Disobedience, Notley says, "Like many writers, I feel ambivalent about words. I know they don't work. I know they aren't it. I don't in the least feel that everything is language. I have a sense that there has been language from the beginning, that it isn't fundamentally an invention. There are contradictory positions, but positions are just words. I don't believe that the best poems are just words. I think they're the same as reality. I tend to think reality is poetry, and that it isn't words. But words are one way to get at reality or poetry, what we're in all the time. I think words are among us and everywhere else, mingling, fusing with, backing off from us, and everything else." To Notley, words are only a small part of poetry, because words cannot fully show the complete meaning. One aspect that makes Notley different from many other poets is her inclusion of other modes through which she attempts to convey the meaning. For example, in The Descent of Alette, Notley distinguishes the poetic foot through use of quotation marks. The purpose of these quotation marks is to indicate a certain speed to the reader. Here's Alice Notley commenting on this use of quotation marks during a lecture at Naropa University. "The poetry is not arranged cleanly or neatly on the page. However, it's arranged with a purpose, and that is to show the reader how to pace him or herself. Throughout Notley's work, a line of writing is established as an auditory unit. When looking at the poetry and writing, this unit is established by the placement of the writing on the page. Here's what Alice Notley had to say in an interview with the Kenyon Review. Lines are a loose organization principle that I don't necessarily follow. Look at the organization of the lines on the page of Mysteries of Small Houses and the use of quotation marks to create the same division as lines in The Descent of Alette." Going along with the idea of the voice, a unique aspect of Notley's poetry is her source of an inspiration. One of the major influences throughout her life has been the prominence of death and grievance. Notley believes that poetry allows her to be in contact with the dead. In an interview with the Los Angeles Review of Books, Notley is quoted as saying, "As a poet, you can talk to anyone you want to, and you can write down anything you want to. You don't make any money, so it doesn't matter what you say. You can give yourself great pleasure just speaking to whoever or whatever might exist. But also, you do rip yourself open if you go through the experiences I have, and you do stand on the chasm between life and death. There's communication, I'm certain of this." This recurring idea of ghosts and ghouls has deeper meaning to Notley as well. Eileen Myles picked up on this idea and presented it in a talk she gave on some of Notley's work. A lot of Notley's ideas come to her while she's asleep, and rather than ignoring these thoughts, she directly translates them into her writing. In fact, this is where her idea for the Descent of Alette came from. Directly and indirectly, this is shown through the first line of the book. Alright, let's switch up themes for a moment and look back into one of the underlying driving forces behind Notley's work that we mentioned earlier, feminism. In today's culture, this is used almost as a buzzword, and the true ideals behind feminism can be lost pretty easily. But Notley takes these feminist ideas to a whole new level. First of all, Notley recognizes herself as the first poet of her type, setting the stage for other women to write about their children in the raw, detailed manner that Notley did. These accounts are seen more abstractly in The Descent of Alette and more straightforward in Mysteries of Small Houses. She claims that she was a freak and a pioneer, writing about pregnancy and motherhood at that time. Notley portrays motherhood with a unique perspective as a writer. She also takes the idea of feminism and twists it around a bit, showing different aspects of femininity through the main character in The Descent of Alette. She says of her idea behind this character, "I found in the story of the Sumerian goddess Inanna and her descent into the underworld, a prototype for Alette. Inanna shows up, she observes, she dies, in fact, is reborn but never fights. She makes certain crucial decisions, and the most profound one being the decision to confront death by appearing at the door of the underworld. Alette, on the other hand, does fight, but the fight is magical and not bloody. It was very difficult for me to stage her fight with the tyrant, since I'm a pacifist, but he's a construct, a symbol. She isn't." Here's Notley's commentary on her view of the feminist culture. Second-generation New York School, feminist and political poetics, and the language poem movement. But Notley believes that being a poet means disobedience and disagreeing with common culture. Writing The Descent of Alette was essentially an act of rebellion to her, as she struggled with the different meanings that she was trying to communicate to the reader. She was rebelling against many commonly regarded facets of society, like the male-dominated culture that she feels blocked her out of the spotlight for so many years, and the lack of meaning behind one's true self. Finally, let's take a quick look into how she has influenced the work of other poets, specifically those from the New York School. Notley's disobedience is also shown through her desire to not fit into one particular group. She refuses to take a definitive label. Though she's commonly associated with the second-generation New York School, Notley refuses this classification. However, her writing has set the stage for many other poets and writers to open up about their experience with pregnancy and motherhood. For example, Notley's influence can be seen in mother and poet Rachel Zucker's work. Zucker was inspired by Notley from the time that she was in school, and she continues to follow in Notley's footsteps, writing about feminism and motherhood in an unadulterated manner. Indirectly, Notley's writing influenced other New York School poets through the work of Ted Berrigan. Berrigan was much more closely associated with the poets from the second generation of the New York School. To wrap this documentary up, Alice Notley was an influential writer whose works were unique and unprecedented for the time in which they were created. Notley explored many topics from a new perspective, and she set the stage for others to follow. Some of her ideas are best summed up in a line she included in her high school graduation speech. "Don't ever be afraid of having people think you're crazy just because you're doing what you have to do."